When I was in my senior year of high school, pre-calculus class to be specific, I was asked an interesting question as a form of an alternative roll call method. What is your biggest fear?
I immediately knew what my answer was, but I wasn't going to let a class of 30-something randoms in on my inner psyche. So I came up with something that made me sound pretentious, mysterious, and probably really weird.
That answer was the unknown.
There are a handful of ways you can take that answer. Mainly, you could believe I'm afraid of the masked entity who lives in the walls of AI Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, which, who isn't? Or you could take my interpretation, which is that the world can be a really scary place when you don't know what's going on or what's going to happen. Thus, having a world of knowns means there's less to fear.
The real answer I was hiding, though, was the dark.
Released in 1992, originally for MS-DOS, Alone in the Dark was a revolutionary, fixed-camera game that pitted the player character, either a private eye named Edward Carnby or a curious family member named Emily Hartwood, against the mystery of Jeremy Hartwood's sudden death by his own hand.
A series of puzzles, demons, 90s computer game jank, and more waited for its turn to strike inside the walls of the Louisiana estate.
Often called the very first survival horror game, Alone in the Dark struck gold with its game design and atmosphere.
Simply put, modern horror games would not be the same without Alone in the Dark.
Lightning rarely strikes twice, though, and while the series continued throughout the 90s and a little into the 2000s, the game's appeal was dwindling. Top this off with 2008's reboot, also called Alone in the Dark, and 2015's Alone in the Dark Illumination being critical flops, and the series was desperately in need of a life raft off its sinking ship. Enter 2024's entry to the series. The reimagining we'll be focusing on today, which is also just called Alone in the Dark. To recap, Alone in the Dark was a really successful pioneer of survival horror, and it continued as a series, though its popularity remained constant at best. The reboot, Alone in the Dark, came along and screwed things right up. The reimagining, Alone in the Dark, is an homage to the original in the style of a modern, over-the-shoulder shooter game, like Resident Evil 2. No, not that Resident Evil 2, this Resident Evil 2.
Why do all these games have the same darn name? There's straight up 3 games just called Alone in the Dark. No subtitle.
At least sports games have the self-awareness to number themselves. Alone in the Dark 2024 was developed by Pieces Interactive and published by THQ Nordic, who I know from making SpongeBob games. Unfortunately, the development team was laid off and their studio was closed in June of 2024, allegedly because of this game's poor sales and reception.
There were some big names tied to this project, so it's evident that people believed in and worked hard on it.
Namely, the aforementioned Emily Hartwood and Edward Carnby are voiced and motion captured by Hollywood stars Jodie Comer, aka Not Emily Blunt, and David Harbour, aka Stranger Things' Jim Hopper. My deepest apologies to Comer, but besides apparently Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker, where she plays Rey's mother in a flashback, I'm not familiar with her work. And every time I see this artwork, I just see Emily Blunt.
David Harbour, on the other hand, I know through his Stranger Things fame, later Marvel casting, and eventual divorce from Lily Allen for totally not embarrassing reasons. Don't look that one up, kids. I'm serious.
In all honesty, David Harbour and the Alone in the Dark name are the only reasons I was remotely interested in this game.
If those two things didn't combine together, I would have skipped over it.
Knowing the checkered past of the Alone in the Dark series, and figuring I could always use more Jim Hopper in my life, I took the plunge into this Resident Evil-inspired game. It's funny, Alone in the Dark paved the way for Resident Evil's original game, and now that series is guiding this one forward.
How good of a job did it do? There's only one way to find out. Grab your parasols and steer clear of any snake oil salesmen, folks. We're off to the bayou.
This is, in all honesty, a really confusing game. So apologies in advance if some of my information is contradictory or just plain wrong. But I'm going to do my best to retell the story as I understood it. The game begins with Emily Hartwood and Edward Carnby driving out to Derceto Manor, which is a mental institution / sanity retreat for the rich people living in the New Orleans area. Emily's uncle, Jeremy Hartwood, is no longer in contact with the family, and this upsets Emily enough to hire Edward as a private investigator to take her out to Derceto to investigate. While a wellness check wouldn't normally require a PI, Emily feels that the characters living and working at Derceto may lead to her needing some backup. Upon arriving to the manor, Emily and Edward discover that the door is locked, and nobody is coming to answer it. At this point, we're given the choice to play as either of the two protagonists. It's learned quickly after picking a character that the true game and all of its endings can only be experienced by playing both characters' points of view, similar to Resident Evil 2's A and B scenarios with Leon and Claire.
Given the choice between Ray's mom or the Jim Hopper, I obviously chose Jim Hopper.
I will say though, and I don't mean to harp on the guy any more than I already have, but David Harbour's performance in this game is really bad. Like, I know he can do better than this.
Unavailable how? Is he sleeping? We can wait. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, you're not wrong. We came here for her uncle. Well, I'm happy you find the evening so harmonious. I hope you don't mind me setting things right. Jeremy's business, that is. This room looks beyond my capabilities. But you wanted to. Can I go?
Still, he's our hero for this campaign, and we will learn to love him.
Edward's first act to earn his $150 paycheck from Emily is to find a way into Derceto. A conveniently ajar garage door is the portal that brings Edward into the strange building that will throw him for the loop of his life. While wandering through the initial rooms of the mansion, the pace and overall gist of the game becomes apparent. We'll be wandering around from area to area, eventually engaging in combat, and checking every nook and cranny for collectibles called lanyapes.
Lanyape means a little something extra.
Being a game set in the bayou around New Orleans in the 20th century, working knowledge of Hollywood voodoo is a good thing to have. Thankfully, I'm fluent due to my exposure to the classic point-and-click adventure game Gabriel Knight: Sins of the Fathers, which is also set in New Orleans. Gosh, I really ought to cover that game someday.
That game explains topics present in Alone in the Dark pretty well, so as tidbits come up that I recognize, I'll chime in and share them with you.
For example, the family Bible item that we discover comes with the question of what Cabri Sankor means. Directly translated, it means goat without horns, but the voodoo answer is human sacrifice. Not knowing that immediately won't hurt your understanding of the game overall, but I find it delightful to be able to grasp concepts of deeper lore here and there. After wandering through the halls of Derceto and finding a nice stockpile of healing tonics and spare bullets, Edward opens the door and lets Emily in. And without a second to spare, the residents and staff of the hospital appear out of thin air.
Strange!
There's a nurse and presumably 3 patients. 1 child, 1 20-something-year-old woman, and 1 drunk guy. The nurse is insistent that Edward and Emily leave immediately, but Emily persists in saying that she needs to see her uncle. It's eventually revealed that Jeremy has gone missing, but the staff is out looking for him. Edward also makes a one-off comment that he thinks he recognizes the young girl, but that's brushed over fairly quickly. Unsatisfied with the answer that Jeremy is just gone, Edward and Emily head upstairs to investigate Jeremy's room to find clues themselves. It's here where the first of many kinda awkward story moments occurs.
I'm not sure I have the vocabulary to explain exactly what goes on, but it's essentially that crazy, unbelievable things happen to the characters and they just don't react at all.
For example, Emily finds out her uncle has straight up vanished, asks a simple "what?", then proceeds like nothing is wrong. The next dialogue she has is with Edward up in Jeremy's room, where she simply says she wants to find clues. Maybe it's because this is Edward's campaign, but you think Emily would be a little more emotive based on the fact that talking to her uncle is the whole reason we came up to Derceto.
All right, here we are.
Let's look around, see if we can dig up any clues.
Jim Hopper isn't immune to this either, and that becomes extremely apparent in just a few minutes. You see, while looking around Jeremy's room, Edward stumbles across the man's diary, and within its pages, he reads all sorts of passages about a mysterious dark man, a place called Tarawea, someone named Juan, some information about Derceto itself, a little about a voodoo priestess named Miss Jackson, etc. After doing some light reading, Emily and Edward agree to go talk to the man in charge of Derceto, Dr. Gray. Emily leaves through the door first, and Edward follows.
Except he doesn't.
When Carnby walks through the door, he's transported into an alternate version of Derceto that's right smack dab in the middle of New Orleans proper, with storefronts lining cobblestone streets and gas lamps dimly lighting the way. His immediate response?
What the hell is going on? Where am I?
And it gets worse from here. Believe me.
Inside this alternate version of Derceto, aggressive plant-like creatures roam the streets, and we'll need to defend ourselves from them. This is where the game's combat system is introduced, and it's about what you'd expect from an over-the-shoulder Resident Evil clone. There are a handful of guns to find and use throughout the game, some scrap melee weapons you can use until they shatter in your hands, a la Breath of the Wild, and some throwable items that can either distract enemies or be used for damage.
It's certainly not the most creative form of combat, but it works well for what it sets out to do.
Edward Carnby and Emily Hartwood are not trained militants, so there's a natural awkwardness to their handling of weapons that makes sense. Plus, it enhances the panic that ensues when an enemy pops out from behind a wall. Floundering around a bit before getting the enemy down adds some excitement. That's for sure. Edward's primary goal in the not New Orleans is to make his way to the adjacent corner store that has its lights on. On the way over, more enemies will pop up, and the balance of ammo consumption and safety enters my mind. Edward can hold a maximum of 20 bullets, plus 6 in his revolver, and ammo pickups are frequent in the first area. As such, I freely used my pistol, which is usually a beginner's trap in early survival horror games.
Here, it's not so bad though.
Inside the corner store, Edward meets a very low FPS man named Batiste, who claims that the realm we are currently in was created via a pact that Jeremy made with the Dark Man, and that Jeremy is able to hide within these pocket dimensions thanks to his talisman, which he got from the previously mentioned Miss Jackson. Her shop is just down the road, and Batiste gives us a set of keys to enter her store to hopefully find Jeremy. He then stays put, presumably condemning himself to a pitiful existence in this world until he inevitably dies of hunger, thirst, or plant zombie.
Logic at its finest.
Quick voodoo tidbit, Batiste describes Miss Jackson as a Mama Loa, which is the most powerful woman in a voodoo sect, at least according to Gabriel Knight.
If any voodoo practitioner could help us out, it'd be a Mama Loa.
A short walk, some shooting, and a dash or two of healing tonic later, and we found our way into Miss Jackson's parlor. But unfortunately, nobody's home. After poking around, Edward finds a talisman of his own, and combined with some notes in Jeremy's diary, he's able to return himself to the real world. Conveniently, he spawns right inside of Dr. Gray's office, and the two men have a sketchy conversation. Dr. Gray makes Edward a sidecar, Edward pokes him on Jeremy's recent behavior, and the trail kind of ends there. Dr. Gray mentions asking the orderlies for assistance, and Edward says that he met Batiste earlier and that he did give us some direction. So Carnby leaves to go follow up on that. What?
How did Edward just so casually mention a man he met in another reality? And how did Dr. Gray take it in stride?
Presumably, if Batiste got lost like Edward did, he's been missing for a while too, and he won't be coming back without a talisman. Dr. Gray surely must know this, but if he does, why isn't Edward, the private investigator, pushing him on this topic? Again, the characters don't really interact, or react for that matter, in believable ways.
I'm getting heated already, and we've just barely started, so I think it's a good time to take a little break. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Conway Twitty.
Nice to see you. It's been a long time. You're just as lovely as you used to be.
The next conversation between a reunited Emily and Edward outside of Dr. Gray's office is grounded in reality. Emily asks where Edward's been, he gets all weird because he traveled through time or space or whatever, and Emily pleads with him to stay grounded. Afraid she'll think he's gone mad, Edward pushes Emily away and continues to investigate the talisman and its teleportation powers independently. It's back to wandering around Derceto, where we eventually find ourselves noticing a broken astronomical clock, which has some sort of tie with the talisman, before eventually walking into a patient's room. There's an encounter with the drunk patient who asks about a lost girl,
Presumably Sarah from Stranger Things Season 1, if David Harbour's character has anything to do with it.
but the chance meeting doesn't pan out to too much in the short game. Inside the patient Elisabetta Perosi's room, we discover that she was a member of a cult of artists that used Derceto as their home before a fatal flood in the early 1900s. According to her journal, the group did some sort of ritual to cause the flood, but more on that later. There's also a note from Jeremy Hartwood that he has mastered the art of memory travel, and that he's aiming to revisit some sort of oil rig with a, quote, hateful mound. I don't know, he kind of just makes stuff up, and Hopper over here just rolls with it.
What makes a mound hateful, anyway?
After a quick random teleportation to both a flood-damaged and on-fire Derceto, plus finding a few pieces for the broken clock later, we're ready to venture back into the memory realm ourselves. Wandering around the mansion with different things changing is interesting, but I'm not entirely sure I'd say it's fun.
The performance on PS5 is also really bad.
I mentioned it earlier with 20 FPS Batiste, but the game does not run well on my console. The worst offenses are when scenes that are clearly meant to be seamless have a very harsh cut to black, or even a loading screen present in between them. For example, this spooky world-changing around you in real time moment was totally shattered because the game did not have the resources, apparently, to render the transition properly. I imagine the developers wanted Derceto to return to normal in the blink of an eye, but that's simply not what happened here. Focusing back up on the story, Jim Hopper is now in the infamous oil field just outside the Hateful Mound, hopefully right on Jeremy's tail. The outdoor swamp environment is fairly cinematic, kind of late Resident Evil 7-y, but the gameplay doesn't vary too much from what we've seen so far. A new enemy that I will be calling Demo Dogs for obvious reasons start showing up, and they can be pretty startling. They burrow underground and only pop up when they have a window to attack, and I'd be lying if I said they didn't jump scare me a handful of times. I also died to a small swarm of them because my mom walked in and asked me to do something while I was trying to dodge them. Thanks, Mom. I also died at this part right here a couple of times because the game is so unclear in its instructions. For whatever reason, Edward wants to climb the oil rig. So after battling 2 demo dogs, we pull the lever and shut off the machine. This somehow causes the entire field to burst into flames, and several more demo dogs spawn. My reaction to this was to run back to the dock of safety where I stood to fight the first 2 demo dogs. But that's not a good idea because the fire kills you almost instantly. What's the solution? Climb the ladder that I didn't see on the shack behind where the camera is pointing. Not the most intuitive game design, in my opinion. The Hateful Mound area ends when we locate the titular burrow as well as the alpha demo dog that inhabits it.
Inside this cozy little home for the winter, another completely nonsensical cutscene takes place.
Hopper's interrupted by a woman, presumably a nurse from Derceto, asking who he is and what he's doing here. Not how he got there, not how to get out, just what he thinks he's doing in her Hateful Mound. What's worse, it doesn't seem like our character cares how she got there either. The response, "I'm looking for Jeremy," is answered by her saying something to the effect of, "Oh, you too?" before the alpha demo dog comes back in and the 2 unsuccessfully try to hide. Hopper goes all Hopper on it with his revolver, but not before stealing the woman's purse and somehow transporting himself back to the real Derceto. What the heck?
Putting aside the miraculous, life-saving stroke of luck he just had, what instinct did he have to grab the woman's bag before making his final stand?
Was he hoping she had some hard candy in there?
This is the kind of stuff I mean when I say that the story relies so hard on people not acting like any real person would in a given scenario.
It's really hard to get into the story when it seems like all the characters are in on something we don't know. The game apologizes to me by giving me a shotgun, though, so I'll keep playing. Inside that purse, which I guess was actually Jeremy's, is a palette knife we can use to jimmy open wedged doors, and a book about religion or something, written by Juan.
You know Juan? Juan! From the diary! Jeremy loves Juan's teachings, and that's important to the story.
In order to get into the next memory world thing, we need to repair the plate on the side of Derceto's boiler, which requires a trip both upstairs to another patient's room and downstairs to the cellar. I started with the latter, and it was fairly self-explanatory. Basically, just keep walking forward until eventually the world does something wonky, then do that. Then, when everything fixes itself, there's usually a plot-important item just sitting there.
Anyone hungry for another cutscene that doesn't make any sense?
Edward Carnby stumbles into a room where the young girl from the beginning of the game is casually drawing. and when prompted to answer if Carnby knows her from somewhere, she responds, "I remember you, Mr. Carnby." Then they change topics entirely.
Do I know you from somewhere?
I remember you, Mr. Carnby.
From where?
Don't touch that. Cassandra wouldn't like it. She wouldn't like it at all.
Do you know where she is?
Personally, if someone mentions they know me from somewhere, I tend to try and figure out where that somewhere is.
I guess I'm not as smart as a licensed private investigator, though.
She also blabs a bit about St. John's Eve, which is one of the most important days in Louisiana voodoo, as that's the day voodoo queen Marie Laveau was said to host her rituals. Skipping ahead past a scavenger hunt to find another couple of pieces for a talisman stone, we're ready to go into the other world again, whatever it's called. This time, we're at the Heartwood family tomb and its surrounding graveyard, again for an unknown reason.
I'm going to call this area the Hateful Graveyard, because calling innocuous areas hateful with no context is, admittedly, really fun.
This area has some pretty decent scares from a new enemy type that pops out of the walls. There are some places, though, where the game loaded their spawns awkwardly, which follows a trend of other technical issues I experienced while playing. Earlier, I mentioned the awkward loading screens, and now we can add pop-in and camera clipping to that list, too. On the bright side, though, the Hateful Graveyard is actually quite aesthetic. The golden hour light drifting through the trees and onto the gravestones, the dark, damp, candlelit halls of the catacombs, and more all play together to create a genuinely fun area to look at. When the game tries, the graphics and environments can be stunningly beautiful. For a AA game, I'm seriously impressed with what the end product looks like at its peak. In somewhere like the Hateful Mound, there simply isn't enough going on visually to take your breath away. But when walking around Derceto or in other alternate world sequences, there are truly spectacular visuals to be enjoyed. Throughout the graveyard, our boy Eddie Corndog will be finding stone statues holding discs with imagery of a hand, an eagle, and a goat that are usually guarded by enemies. I did some stealth to avoid fights, some running like a coward at Hopper's prompting, and I even busted out the new shotgun to chug through a minor swarm of 2 whole guys. 2 of them. Placing the 3 discs into the final doorway leads to a room with an apparently deceased Elisabetta Perosi. But before Carnby can check on her, he's stopped by none other than Jeremy Heartwood, the man we've been looking for the whole game. Edward immediately recognizes him and begins asking questions about where we are and why Jeremy's doing whatever it is he's doing, but we only get a few vague answers. From this brief conversation, we discover that Jeremy has made a deal with the Dark Man, aka the Devil, aka Voldemort, because apparently we can't say his name out loud. Upon the conclusion of their agreement, Jeremy's soul will belong to the Dark Man, bringing ruin upon Derceto and Derceto alone.
Through context clues, it seems as though Jeremy is sacrificing himself to protect the world as a whole, minus the mansion.
Finally, Jeremy's perking up at the mention of Tarawea brings Edward to the conclusion that finding his way there may help dissolve the contract between Jeremy and the Dark Man, with the latter entity appearing and spooking Jeremy enough to trip Edward into slamming his head onto a stone table. Our time in the Talisman world draws to a close. Upon re-entering the real world, Edward wakes up to find that the Derceto patient that had been laid to rest in Jeremy's world has actually passed on in the real world as well. always a stoic man, Edward does not care, and we're off to unlock Jeremy's trunk with the new key we found. This leads us to the telescope, which ultimately directs us to the oft-discussed fictional convent of Tarawea.
And while we're talking about directions, allow me to direct you to our next special guest. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Conway Twitty.
There's no need in going over all the things that took me on.
Chapter 3 begins when Edward is able to visit the library of Tarawea himself, and he meets Juan, the author of a book Jeremy read once and really enjoyed. Serving as a happy place in his mind, Jeremy created the memory of Tarawea's convent and the character of Juan to hold the answers to inner peace. Inside the walls of the safe place lies the library, which should hold the answers we're looking for.
Also, Voldemort. Voldemort's in there too. Whoa.
Tarawea's another place where the game's graphics and lighting really shine. The main library in the convent of Tarawea is dusty, sure, but it's highlighted by these spectacular sun rays beaming in through the windows.
We have more pressing things to talk about in Tarawea, but I had to pause and give praise where praise is due.
As for the gameplay of the library, we're basically just walking. Going up a series of stairwells leads Jim Hopper to this cross-shaped key, which will be our ticket to the knowledge we seek. Immediately after picking it up, the Dark Man manifests, and it's time for our first true face-to-face encounter with him.
He almost resembles an Egyptian pharaoh, with long robes and a full ceremonial face mask.
Just like Juan said, Voldemort is going to be pressuring us, and the only way to survive is to suppress the evil emanating from him.
A conceal, don't feel sort of thing.
Except we don't need to do that, because the Dark Man could not care less that we're here. Seriously, I'll admit I felt my heart rate jump when he first showed up, but when I realized he was just another guy checking out the books in the library, and that he had no interest in doing me harm, that all kind of dissipated. After scooching by him a time or two in order to get to the heart of the library, he so rudely interrupted and stole Edward Carnby's book that he was reading. Not only that, but he then had the audacity to do his little dark magic thing to send Edward into a really sudden depressive spiral, which Juan had to come bust him out of. Two things. One, Juan is the best character in this game. I can see why Jeremy idolized him. Two, this game presents that it's about expelling the Dark Man's influence from Jeremy and Derceto as a whole. And I wanted to remind you that if you're struggling with something like that yourself in the real world, know there's always hope and brighter days to come. There are resources if you need them, and you genuinely do make the Earth a happier place. Alright? Alright. Juan and Carnby chat about what just happened, and in the most believable voice acting to date from David Harbour, it's evident that we need to chase down Jeremy's first encounter with Voldemort, which was at a magic show somewhere in New Orleans.
I was so close. There must be something I can work with. Come on, Carnby, think. Think! The shipping company. Prext. Right.
Good luck, detective.
With some information about the shipping company that handles the magician's supplies, it's off to Derceto to find a path to the bayou once again.
Thankfully, we don't have to look far. Well, actually, we don't have to look at all. As soon as we exit Jeremy's memory of Tarawea, we're in a ballroom, and this woman is here. I know for sure she has a name, but I don't remember what it is. She's drinking her drink and dancing her dance and sort of going back and forth with Hopper about this shipping company before she suddenly does this.
Money during the war. Their waterfront office is just over there.
How did you do that?
What? An actually good, disorienting, puzzling moment?
This moment led me to believe that the Derceto residents aren't real, or at least certain ones aren't real, which was very motivating.
Finally, we're getting some hard evidence that the mystery runs deep, as opposed to characters just popping in and out of existence randomly knowing things, which could literally just be bad writing.
I still stand by the fact that Edward Carnby does not approach conversations like a normal person would, which is bad writing, but the rest of the people around him acting strange does make sense with the lore the game is establishing. The New Orleans docks are an interesting enough kind of place, with more enemies to fight and places to explore, though I will say my Lenape count hasn't gone up too much in the last couple of locations. I could just be missing them, but I feel like I'm searching high and low. While we are at the docks, our objective is to find a ship's manifest or some other sort of document to figure out where the shipping company delivered the magician's supplies, with our ultimate goal being to figure out when, where, and how the Dark Man and Jeremy met. A little sewer crawling later, and we find not only the manifest with an address that we were looking for, but also the third and final weapon for Edward, a Tommy gun, rounding out our arsenal of a pistol, shotgun, and something automatic that Resident Evil has gotten us accustomed to. Walking into the theater where Jeremy met the Dark Man, it becomes clear to us that while he traveled from town to town posing as a wandering magician, he is in fact an ancient entity from Egypt whose real name is Nyarlathotep.
I'm just going to call him the Dark Man.
The name of his game is to strike deals with those he encounters, then reap the benefits later on. Jeremy is here, recounting this tale to us, and he also says that the terms of his contract have been lost to the sand-swept sunken desert tomb that the Dark Man calls home. Jeremy is stupendously reluctant to break his contract, though, as he believes his actions are the only thing keeping the real world safe. Edward doesn't buy this and uses his talisman to chase down the contract. Walking through the sarcophagus leads us into the cool desert air lit only by the bright moon and the occasional lantern. It's not long before Jim Hopper is Raiders of the Lost Arking down into the sunken desert temple, where some mirror puzzles stand between him and the terms and conditions of Jeremy's contract.
You guys don't want to know what he'd do to read a cease and desist letter. It's intense.
While walking around here, I didn't feel much. The light reflecting puzzles, while somewhat captivating and definitely fresh, just weren't much to chew on. I was on autopilot running around the temple, like I had been for most of the game. Even the enemies, by now, have become formulaic. I have all these weapons to use, but the best strategy is still to shoot them once, then just wail on them with a shovel. In no time at all, I had completed the area and found the contract, which is in the form of redacted Derceto intake papers. In the funniest scene yet, Edward is carried off by these mutant bat things as our man David Harbour just acts his booty off.
Good going, Dave.
This somehow causes us to wake up next to the one and only not Emily Blunt in the attic of Derceto.
Oh, by the way, strap in because this exchange makes no sense at all.
Miss Hartwood is skeptical of what Carnby's been up to, even accusing him of hiding in the attic to drink. And when he explains how he's found a way to break Jeremy's contract, she brushes that aside to explain how she thinks 2 Derceto patients and maybe the clerk are dead. You know what Hopper says to this?
I'm pretty sure 2 of the patients are dead and maybe even the clerk.
Oh yeah, I kind of just gave up on worrying about that.
And Emily is just cool with this. She asks what we're up to, and after we explain in a single sentence all the bizarre things we've done, she responds with a single word. All right. No, it's really not all right. You two are the only outsiders in an evidently strange place, and you're treating it like a Scooby-Doo episode.
Stop splitting up, don't keep secrets from each other, and actually work together to solve the mystery.
I've said it time and time again, but this game's writing really could have used a second pass. Most, if not all, of the interactions between the playable character and the other supporting roles are inconceivably one-sided, and our detective character is acting nothing like how I'd expect someone of his profession to act, leaving threads unfollowed, questions unanswered, or unasked for that matter, and not using all of his resources to solve the mystery is baffling to me. Night has fallen over Derceto, and a rainstorm has kicked up as well. During this next stretch of gameplay, the mansion does take on an eerie, hostile vibe, with Edward not knowing who to trust, who is real, or who could be lying in wait around any corner.
A lot of stuff comes all at once, so it's easy to get disoriented and lose track of what you are doing.
1 second, you're interacting with this guy and the kid, but the next, you're interrupted by the Dark Man ominously pointing into a room, like you got a D on your math test and he's putting you in timeout. A bunch of doors that were previously opened are now locked or barricaded, so moving from area to area is more difficult. Unfortunately, this difficulty is all for naught, as there are no enemies or anything else to keep you entertained while you're running laps around Derceto. To go over specifics in chronological order, Batiste and the woman from our beloved Hateful Mound are back in Derceto proper, but they're not doing so hot. In fact, we'll see several staff members break into coughing fits or collapse to the floor during this next chapter. There's a lot of talk about praising or celebrating the mother, and with that aforementioned knowledge of what Cabri Sankor means, along with a mention that this girl named Grace is one, we can deduce that Derceto is gearing up for a voodoo ritual. We also discover this tree is like God to these people, by the way. Not only does it try and talk Carnby into participating in the ritual, but this drunk guy goes on and on about it as well.
The Feast of St. John, I should say. Through this conversation, we learn that the people are getting ready for the Feast of St. John.
While running through the halls, I had the Dark Man jump scare me, and that led me into what is legitimately the best part of the game.
I don't know where this writer was for the chapters before and after this segment, but they should have been paid more to stick around.
Pointing into one of the previously vacant rooms, the Dark Man directs Edward into confronting something he's been running away from for the entire game, his own past.
You want to know why Carnby took this job? Are you curious who the human sacrifice girl, Grace, is? This stretch of the game answers it all.
Upon walking into the room, Edward makes a startling and gut-wrenching revelation. This room belongs to him. Scratched into the walls of Derceto is a hint for the safe code, and following that lead all the way to its end causes Grace's artwork to trigger another memory trip, this time with Carnby as the host. We appear in his detective office, and we begin retracing the footsteps of a case that's been haunting him since it went awry. Throughout Edward's memory segment, a pseudo-unreliable narrator thing is going on, where we visit various locations related to the case. Then we try and piece together what happened there to keep the mystery going. In a nutshell, Hopper was called in when a woman's husband allegedly kidnapped their daughter and attempted to flee the state. Through receipts, ledgers, and information from witnesses, the two escapees were tracked from their home to an art resale house where profits from the sale of a family painting allowed the runaways to stay at a hotel before ultimately leaving for Florida, presumably for Disney World. As we chase their ghosts, our protagonist has to face his own ghosts along the way, such as his excessive drinking, gambling problems, and the overall lackluster handling of his own life. In the end, we discover that Edward ran the father and daughter off the road and into a river, and despite having enough time to save both, Edward left the father submerged in the car, sealing his fate.
The bad news cherry on top of all of this is that it was the girl's mother who ended up being neglectful, so she was much better off in the hands of her loving father.
The cherry on top of that cherry on top, that girl was Grace. That's why she's familiar to Carnby. Edward awakens submerged in a bathtub, and luckily, Emily pulls him out. She explains yet again how things are weird in the mansion, and she even says her reading makes her believe the grounds themselves cause derangement in patients and staff.
This place? There are some very disturbed figures around here. And I don't think it's just the patients. I've been reading some things about how Derceto has a deranging effect on people. I think it might explain things.
What?
Just take it easy, okay?
Then she walks away. Bye, Emily.
Lightning round of stuff in order to get us back on track.
We have to get into Dr. Gray's office in order to search his desk, which contains some papers about Jeremy believing false memories. There's also some stuff about an MRI that's kept in the basement for some reason, so we go down there to check it out. In the infirmary, there's Jeremy's brain scan, yes, but also some papers on lobotomy.
Whoa!
Putting the MRI back together gives us a clay piece, for some reason, and access back to the attic. Here, we unlock a box with Jeremy's initials on it, reassemble his clay figure, and dial the talisman into Jeremy's most pivotal memory, the hateful steamboat.
No, I'm just kidding. It's just called the Steamboat. But how could I resist?
I enjoy the ambiance and Louisiana charm of the steamboat, but it's just more of the same stuff, gameplay-wise. Our task is to start the steamboat back up, which will free Jeremy, who is apparently stuck here.
To be honest with you, the endgame sequence we're about to enter makes the entire game's plot super not worth even entertaining. So I'm gonna stop making sense of the cards we're dealt. You'll see what I mean in just a moment.
As Carnby explores the boat and ultimately gets it moving again, he grows frustrated with Jeremy's lack of effort in righting his wrongs. And this culminates in Edward stumbling into a therapy session between Jeremy and Dr. Gray as the influence of the real world continues to seep in. Seething with anger, Edward shouts at Jeremy to stop ignoring him, but in the very next instant, the illusion fades, and we're back in the real world as Dr. Gray questions what we're yelling at.
This was an interesting development, and it's very indicative of the oncoming collapse of the plot.
Like I said, more on that in just a moment. More confused than ever, Hopper sets his sights on Dr. Gray himself, specifically his apartment. Emily has already found her way in, and while she explains her findings and theories about Derceto's long-standing history of mass delusions, Edward finds himself the final talisman portal of the game, which takes him into the world of a snowy mountain. This is probably the most exciting place we've seen yet in terms of gameplay, because we have an actual boss fight here. There's a single half hour left in the game, and we finally get to fight our first boss.
That seems poorly planned out.
The fight is against a man named Jacob, who, to my understanding, was sort of the previous Jeremy who held back the Dark Man from the world. I think Jeremy's pact with the Dark Man is a replacement for Jacob, and by fighting him, we're breaking the concept of the pact overall? Maybe? Combat-wise, this boss fight is really solid. We have a boss health bar on top of the screen, a lot of ammo and throwables lying around. You know, video game stuff. There's 2 phases of the fight, one before a puzzle and one after, but they're basically the same. I don't know. After having played hours and hours of the game without something like this, it's nice to finally get it, but it's literally just an over-the-shoulder shooter boss fight. Super simplistic, but great to actually be able to experience one.
The game really should have had more stuff like this.
Puzzles are great, they're a cornerstone of what Alone in the Dark is, but even the original game had some more combat than what we've seen in this modern reimagining.
All right, buckle up because this is where things get weird.
Things we've come to know and accept are turned upside down. New concepts are thrown in, and we're told to believe them, and by the time we're able to slow down and catch our breath, the game ends.
I really think the ending of this game was botched, and it all starts going downhill here.
A mutated Jacob and Edward go toe-to-toe, with the fight ending in a Balrog-style fall through every dream sequence we had experienced, ultimately ending in the halls of Derceto. That was visually a cool sequence, by the way. I liked that. Too bad it culminates in a complete blow to the plot. Jacob gets stabbed in the eye with a ritualistic dagger that Edward had been holding on to for a bit. And as the illusion fades, we discover that Jacob was never our enemy. Jeremy was on the receiving end of the dagger, which is actually an everyday ice pick. There's no time to check on the man we were sent here to save, though, as the Dark Man is hot on our tail. After running, Hopper decides to face his fear, and he pistol whips the entity, plain and simple. In doing so, he knocks its mask off to reveal that it's an orderly in a costume.
What?
Batiste comes in and restrains Edward as a nurse injects him with a sedative.
This means, if we take everything at face value, that nothing we have done this entire game was real.
Anytime we used the talisman, anytime we saw the Dark Man, all of that was based on the delusions and fear that Derceto conjures.
This makes 0 sense.
Without knowing anything about the Dark Man, or geez, anything about Derceto itself, you're telling me Hopper was able to hallucinate visiting places he's never been, meeting real-world people he's never met before, and being scared of an entity he'd never come to know?
Think back to the first place we traveled to.
We met Batiste. Batiste is a real guy, and we just perfectly imagined him without ever having a point of reference? And I don't buy that Edward was a Derceto patient this whole time. That would require the beginning of the game to be entirely fake, and no evidence is presented for that to be true. Edward has a gun, and he got more guns from the dream world that he brought into the rest home? I don't think so.
With that in mind, the talisman worlds had to be real, but the enemy within them wasn't?
Or is the Dark Man an actual real demonic entity that everybody at Derceto gaslights Jeremy into thinking is fake?
Alright, I need to calm down. There's more we need to cover, but I'm just too riled up to deal with it right now. I need a little break. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Conway Twitty.
I see the sparkling little diamond on your hand.
Edward Carnby reawakens and is brought into the greenhouse of Derceto, where he's shown to a miraculously, perfectly lobotomized Jeremy and Dr. Gray. Emily's handling her uncle's newfound mental state seemingly well, but she's nowhere to be seen at the moment. Everybody else has gathered, though, to celebrate the Feast of St. John. Despite everything seeming calm as we walk around and chat with the different participants, once the party formally begins, things go bad fast. As we've discovered and learned throughout the game, this Feast of St. John celebration requires a Cabri Corps, aka a goat without horns, aka a human sacrifice. In this case, the target is Grace, the young girl who Edward knows from his past.
It turns out the feast is a long-standing Derceto ritual to appease the entity known as the Black Goat of the Woods, or as her followers call her, Shub. I don't want to go near that.
As Edward fails to stop the ritual and save Grace's life, Emily reappears and takes matters into her own hands, which leads to the awakening of the Black Goat of the Woods herself, who has been masquerading as a freaking tree for Derceto's entire history. Enraged at the ruination of the ceremony, the tree starts whipping people left and right, and as Emily and Jeremy escape out one door, the tree grows legs and stomps through the halls of the mansion, leaving many deaths in its wake. Edward regains his senses and fearlessly charges after it. So now we're running through the ruins of Derceto, chasing down a giant mobile tree with a racist name, and honestly, it's a really fun sequence. The entire spectacle is so absurd, surreal, and just plain goofy that you can't help but chuckle.
No more than 5 minutes ago, I was trying to figure out what part of the game's story was real and what part wasn't. And now I'm shooting at moving wood.
Marking our second of 2 boss fights in this entire 8-hour game, the Black Goat of the Woods is by far the more confusing of the 2. The strategy is the same, I think, which is to say you just shoot the thing, but there are Resident Evil 2 remake style pimple weak points you can shoot, but I don't think they're essential in completing the fight. At one point, I picked up a crucifix and thought I had to melee attack in some sort of symbolic way, but that didn't do anything either. In the end, you just had to shoot it a lot. The fight was also really laggy at times, and I don't know why. I was playing this game on the PlayStation 5 Slim, but the PS5 Pro wasn't even released when this game came out. Oh well. As the big old tree falls to the ground, Jeremy, Emily, Grace, and Edward gather outside Derceto before beginning their trek back to New Orleans proper. The sunrise over the mansion's charred remains, marking the sunset of this game.
Ooh, boy. Now I gotta talk about this game holistically, don't I? Can we do another Conway Twitty? No? Okay.
Alone in the Dark was definitively a video game.
All joking aside, I found this game to be super generic. Like the kind of game you'd have a character on a TV show talk about when they're supposed to sound nerdy.
I don't think anything this game did was better than average, be it the gameplay, psychological horror, aesthetics, or anything else.
I can recommend this game only if you have access to it the same way that I did, for free through something like PS Plus or Xbox Game Pass.
All that criticism doesn't mean it's a bad game though, by any means. I enjoyed the early game when everything was confusing and pieces were still falling into place, but the game narratively lost me when it took those puzzle pieces, threw them off the table, then told me I had wasted my time. At no point did I lose sleep over theorizing what the Dark Man was or how Derceto plays a part in his power, but I was pretty peeved when it turned out he was nothing. Was he nothing? It's evident that throughout its lifespan, Derceto was a home for strange people. Cults, art colonies, the generally unstable. Derceto was home to them all. The fact that nobody but Jeremy believed the Dark Man was real, only for his appearance to be used for the Feast of St. John, leads me to believe that somehow Jeremy conjured up this fictional villain. Then we spent basically the entire game fighting a ghost, which doesn't leave a great taste in my mouth. Then, in the finale, the freaking Black Goat of the Woods comes out of nowhere off the top rope to shake things up again, which was fun, but a complete non sequitur to what we had been fighting the whole game.
Also, the biggest unresolved plot point in my mind was Edward's room.
Particularly, how did Grace, the orphan, end up at this wicked expensive medical retreat in the boonies?
Who's paying for her to be here?
At the end of the game, she seems to accept Grace as her name, and Hopper verifies she's the girl he's dealt with in the past, so that's a crazy coincidence that she'd end up where he'd eventually have a case. The general shakiness of the plot, which ebbs and flows as required to get the game to its unsatisfying conclusion, makes the game incredibly hard to recommend for a story experience. Resident Evil 2 isn't going to win any Oscars, but it has a clear beginning, middle, and end, with real characters and plot points stringing the game together. Alone in the Dark has ideas, but they're disorganized and seem to lead in a couple of different directions. Like, if you remember back to the start of the game, Jeremy had gone missing, so the orderlies were searching for him.
Where did he actually go?
We're led to believe he was in the Talisman world, but that wouldn't have culminated in such a casual reunion at the end of the game. So the players are left holding the bag, trying to figure out what was real and what was not. Truthfully, I don't think the game even knows.
So that's Alone in the Dark. A very confusing, relatively harmless, quick jaunt of a video game whose poor sales, unfortunately, led to the closure of its developer. That actually sucks. What also sucks is that you imagined this whole video. I'm not here. I'm in Tarawea with Mr. Conway Twitty.
I can almost hear the stillness as it yields to the sound of your heart beating.